Happy Friday to our LinkedIn friends. Thank you for joining us for another weekly privacy chat. We've been doing them regularly on Friday because we know the week has been incredibly busy with so many data protection developments, and it's nice to catch up on some of the top things that have gone on. But today, rather than catching up on the chaos of this past week, maybe at the end we'll comment on a couple of the big stories. I'm going to ask us to pause and maybe look at a big picture and look back in history to understand how it's shaping the developments of data protection in one of the most exciting and fast-changing regions of the world. I'm joined by Future Privacy Forum's Mercy King-Ori, who helps lead our growing work and our deep interest in the African continent. So many giant regions. I'm always embarrassed. I just came back from APAC, and just the idea of thinking of something as sort of like a region when it's huge distance, huge distances to travel, different cultures, different languages, but yet efforts to collaborate across those regions and cultures. And Africa indeed is as many of you know, a vast place with many different cultures, each with its own history. And Mercy recently did a detailed piece that I hope you will read. I think we've got it in the invitation, but we'll post it in the comments here again on some of the history that has been driving developments in Africa. I think those of us who don't know the region as well, have this sort of very limited view. We think, well, still developing in some economic areas. We think looking at Europe and at US for reactions and input. But I don't think we fully appreciate, maybe we know something about, the history of colonialism, the history of the slave trade, but we may not appreciate some of the unique cultural and social and tribal and communal elements. And as Mercy points out, there's even some conception that, well, privacy isn't so important or wasn't important because of communal obligations instead of the individual, or isn't so important because there's an urge for development or for research across communities. And it's, of course, far more complicated than that. So, Mercy, thank you for joining, and please share with us. Some of our readers probably read this. Hopefully, some of them are going to read it as soon as they hear from us. But give a little bit of an overview of what, why did you write this? What were you looking to help inform the broader data protection community? And share a little bit of kind of what you set out in this piece.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Jules, for having me here. And I actually like that you said the blog actually addressed some of the African issues, because the continent is big and the perspectives, are different depending on the region. And that's actually one of the disclaimers that we began putting in the blog, that any generalizations that the blog or the AC could have need to be read in the light that Africa is not doesn't have a single story, and the story is huge. So when we came down to write this piece, what inspired us was the narrative of privacy and data protection seems to be taking the trajectory of only two regions, Europe and privacy. And I think it's more entrenched right now when the transatlantic cross-border discussions are taking foot. So we thought it would be important, to just give a small background of what privacy could have looked like, will look like in the future in Africa. Yeah. So how the discussion took the trajectory of this. First of all, looking at pre-colonial Africa. After pre-colonial Africa, we had a chance to look at now colonial Africa, and now in the era of globalization, how does privacy and data protection look like, or will look like? So when in discussing the discussion of pre-colonial Africa, one of the things that first we began with is demystifying the myth that privacy is not important in Africa, and this has for long been the main idea, and we point out this dominant position has come about because of this perceived discussion of private communal living to be the most dominant perspective. But what we try to do, and privacy, as we all know, doesn't have one definition, and it's still ambiguous, still evolving. We try to move with the conception of privacy from the lens of individualism, and this is important because it has been for the longest time the dominant discussion, and we try to locate the individualism as it is commonly understood in privacy within the African communal context. Of course, this is not easy because one of the challenges of pre-colonial Africa was, as the blog mentions, the strong communal bonds that existed. And so, what happens then when we're thinking of privacy, it then becomes easy to say, privacy is non-existent, it's not important, it's not valued. But we try to look for anecdotal evidence to show that, privacy could have actually have existed. And we explained there could be two. One of the reasons why this might not have emerged properly is the form of knowledge transmission in traditional Africa could be one of the reasons that prevented a proper development of an African conception of privacy, because traditional African knowledge was passed down through oral traditions, yeah, and we know the power of writing. What gets written down gets passed down in history, yeah. And this could actually been one of the greatest undoing for privacy, because if you think about it here, we read the seminal paper of Warren and Brandeis, The Right to Privacy. It's seminal because it was written down. But what happens then in communities where they did have a chance to, write down their history of privacy? We try again, and then we move into colonial Africa and explain, what could have, we try and, demystify what could have happened and why an African conception of privacy didn't emerge by then. And I think at this point it's also important to explain why, to explain that, during colonial Africa, the conditions at the time, the power imbalances of the time, the power structures that existed between the colonial administrators and the colonial and the people and the countries that were being colonized at the time. Also, it's also important to remember, also they found a closely knit community that was disintegrated, through colonial strategies such as divide and rule. So the strong ties that held the communities at the time also began disintegrating. So during colonial times, institutions that violated their privacy were established. And I mentioned that, some of these institutions that were created, for example, I use the example of what I call the Kipande system, is the ID system, identification system, that of the time that was being used. And what happened in through the Kipande system, it was the Kipande system was a sort of a system for colonial administrators to administer labor for the settler farms, where male adults of 15 years and above would have to wear something around their neck that contained details on their name, their fingerprints, where they lived and where they would work. And I argue that these are some of the things that modern day privacy is concerned about. Some of this data is sensitive personal data, but because of the conditions of the time, it was nearly impossible, to assert any form of privacy. But there was backlash. The political parties of the time came out and said, this thing that you're causing young African men to wear around the neck, first of all, is very humiliating. And when you think more philosophically about what was really happening, it is such a ripe discussion, for privacy and discussions of autonomy, discussions of dignity, the values that modern day privacy seeks to protect. Yeah. So I say that this is one that era, unfortunately, provides us. It was a missed opportunity for the African continent or communities to assert what they really wanted out of privacy. What were their privacy expectations? Fast forward, to post-colonial Africa. and post-colonial Africa came now with formal institutions like constitutions and governments. So I discussed the issue of the constitutions, of post-colonial constitutions, and how they were and how they now introduced the formal understanding of privacy as we know it. So what you see by now is that a formal understanding of privacy through the Bill of Rights has been introduced in constitutions. So Africa's first definition of privacy can be found in its constitutional bodies. And this wasn't in all of them, yeah, because one of the examples that you came across was Ghana's independent constitution, which had no right to privacy, yeah. And when independence was granted to most of the countries, what happened was the founding fathers of Africa got rid of the constitutions, and now by doing that, the Bill of Rights was also gone. But this was also reinstated thanks to to the financial crisis of 1970s and 80s, when most African countries had to to be introduced into structural adjustment programs, and this this was conditional funding, was conditional on you need to adhere to certain conditions for you to access certain kind of financial assistance. And one of these was, reinstatement of bills of rights and constitutions. So privacy was revived, yeah. And this now became, you could say, the formalized privacy understanding of privacy that has now been translated into more modern constitutions, because most African countries have had a chance to have new constitutions after the independence constitutions, and now that's how we have had this formal understanding of privacy. Of course, that doesn't stop there, because fine, you have the right to privacy in your constitution, but what does it mean? So what this did, again, provided an opportunity for African countries from a privacy perspective to define for them. But unfortunately, that actually didn't happen again. This time, the external forces was, um, foreign partnerships, trying in the name of supporting harmonization of laws in Africa, and some of them were information privacy laws. And this is seen again in existing regional economic communities, some of them which have their own standalone data protection instruments, such as the ECOWAS and the Southern African ones. All this are creations of external influences of how we need to understand privacy without thinking about what really does the populace really want. So that has been it, and we conclude, we really ask. So now globalization has arrived. Do we really need an African conception of privacy, or because even most data protection laws that are being enacted right now are still insistent on copying from the GDPR. That's the most common one. Previous ones that relied on the defunct EU directive are being updated. For example, like Mauritius updated their data protection law to reflect a GDPR's kind of a law. So the trend appears to have gotten speed, and it's, I think, time for us to ask ourselves, what do we really want?
Yeah, that's a great overview. I can say, as someone who spends a lot of time looking at this globally, there certainly is strong pressure, both for countries who think that, well, if the most sophisticated or the strongest, best data protection law is this one or that one, that's what we ought to use as our model, or because there's pressure from companies or others who want harmonization and simplification. And of course, there's some probably universal truths when it comes to data protection. I mean, the fair information principles, resonate because they've give us a framework. But it would be lovely to see, and I think we see this a little bit in some countries. Where is it that given this framing, where is it that we have a desire for stronger support for research because we have more of a communal sense that there is such a, an obligation, and that's not a, good or bad data protection decision. Many countries in Europe have default rules that your organs can be used for organ donation when you die, which is a incredible, privacy, integrity, dignity intrusion. But their culture, even in Europe with the individual, dignity is you would love to get such an organ if you desperately needed it to save your life. There is a communal obligation. And of course, in the countries where that is the default, the rate of organ donation is significant, and it's far less, elsewhere. And so lots of room, to really shape. Of course, we need consent, but is it default one way, or is it driven by more of a communal desire? And I think we don't see enough jurisdictions really analyzing how does our culture and what we would like to achieve reflect, well, we need research, or we have a deep desire, for instance, the right to be forgotten, which was starting to develop in a number of countries around the world, including some where they're still examining their very recent history. And the notion that somebody could just, contact Google and say, please delete, some atrocities that I'm responsible. And then we have to hope that they'll research it or push back, as opposed to simply, well, somebody's saying to delete, I'll take it down. No, maybe that's not the default that a certain country should have because it wants, an available record for these sorts of things. Let me ask you this. You did a really interesting report as well for FPF a little while ago, where you looked at the strategies of the different data protection authorities. Do we see any consistent sort of building on any of the issues you've raised? What did we learn about where they're going? Are they in large part still sort of building out some of the, building blocks of their law and, starting to do priority enforcements? Do we see anything that shows sort of influence of this history? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, sure. So the current trajectory. So currently, around 20 African countries have established their DPAs. Yeah, and when we were looking at some of these DPAs, we tried to look at established ones. And established ones, I speak of those that started around 2012 up to right now in latest 2021. So one that caught my attention was, the DPA of Mauritius. So Mauritius has a robust data protection authority that's actually trying to do a lot of work. But one of the trends that we saw in Mauritius and in other countries was the enforcement is not as strong. Most of the decisions of already in action data protection authorities are in providing prior authorizations for data transfers and data. It's actually not data transfers, data processing. We because when you go and just look at the kind of authorizations that have been given, most of them don't specify whether the processing was, for transfer to another country, but most of them have tried to do a lot of prior authorizations of data processing. So we did not come across a DPA that has taken time to, see whether their practice is embedded or aligns with the cultures of the countries that they're operating on. But you see, we can't really fully make the judgment now because most DPAs are barely, 5 years old. And let's give them time. I'd say let's give them time because the challenges of a country will now determine how a DPA responds to the issues. And if a DPA most of the time will get complaints, of probably from marginalized groups, it may be forced, to respond to the needs, to the contextual needs of certain groups. But I think in that line, I'd say let's give them time and see what their actions would look like. Yeah.
And what about pets, privacy enhancing technologies? This is very much the, leading conversation in a number of jurisdictions. How can you use sophisticated de-identification or other techniques to avoid data protection harms. Are any of the DPAs taking a leadership role in supporting, thinking about advancing pets, or are they still dealing with some of the more basic legal structures?
No, they are. I think it's a twofold responsibility, and I think that's, I would say, the blessing or the curse of most DPAs in Africa. They have to establish while also enforce, which is actually a huge task. I'll use the Kenyan example. The Kenyan example, the Office of the Data Protection Commissioner, their mandates, they are very clear on promoting privacy by design. But at the same time, and it's actually stated in their strategic documents that they're keen on promoting privacy by design. We are yet to see any guidelines that specify then what do we mean privacy by design. Does it now mean that as an entity you need to be taking up pets? But we also see, if we're trying to allude to pets, we see in most data protection laws they allude to, if you're an organization handling data, you need to have appropriate security safeguards. They are not yet explicit on what then these appropriate security safeguards look like. So we are looking up to most of our DPAs to provide guidelines, and we hope that they will be discussing pets, but I'm sure that is something that is on top of most DPA's agendas.
Yeah, I'll certainly say, I mean, this week the UK put out some interesting pets and de-identification work. And, even the DPAs that have been at this for a longer time and have big teams and technical teams, I think are still trying to figure out how to give the appropriate guidance. And there's still a lot of confusion, and companies and researchers that aren't sure what is actually called for, what would actually meet legal standards. This is an area where we're hoping to help DPAs who work globally and want to learn from each other and share knowledge. Laws and culture are always going to be different. The basics of how a particular technology works ought to be something that could be globally understood, and then one can assess, of course, does it meet the standard we have in each country. But I think a basic detail of the mathematical risk that is left when one uses different, de-identification techniques. This is a place where there might be some value to have a communal knowledge. I was reading recently about the debate in Cameroon, which is dealing with a big refugee situation, and IDs that are being provided, and some of the privacy criticism, and of course the authorities declaring they need this in order to properly fund and support and be aware of the details of managing and supporting the refugee population. Is there an echo there to the colonial system that you were talking about, where there was backlash? It was the Kapende, right? If I pronounce it properly. Is there an echo? Is some of the backlash sort of resonant of that sort of thing? Obviously, it's not a colonial versus the local population. It's but it's a government authority versus refugees for their benefit, but of course with potential risks.
Yeah, that's actually spot on, because the entire identification system that's currently in Africa, even before we go to the digital ID systems that are mushrooming, the entire identification system definitely has its own colonial legacies. And I think it's currently becoming worse, especially when we're discussing digital ID, that's in very many countries. And when we discuss digital IDs and marginalization, we cannot fail to discuss, the imposition of a system that has not been well thought out and well thought to cater for all the needs of the populace. And when we discuss digital ID, what comes to mind, in addition to the Cameroon case, it's the monumental Huduma number case in Kenya, where it was a biometric system, where people were supposed to register their personal data and eventually get a national ID system. Of course, it was challenged in court, but it was the court upheld the rolling out of the system. But but one of the things that the court was keen on insisting was there needs to be a proper data protection system in place. This saw the Data Protection Act of 2019 become law. There were also regulations that were developed in that light, and the rolling out has definitely not been smooth, because one of the requirements in most of these digital ID systems is you need to have first your physical national ID card system. And it's not only in Kenya, in most systems, most African digital ID systems. Already the national ID system has been previously a tool of exclusion, yeah? And now what this has meant is now data that's being collected has seen some certain communities being excluded. Yeah. So the situation in Cameroon is just one of the cases that's happening, and just a continuation of the challenges that we are trying to deal with, from a privacy and data protection perspective, and more particularly for communities that have for the longest time been excluded from such systems.
Well, speaking of excluded communities, in our comments, Ben Weber asks whether there's some discussion about the trade-offs of individual privacy and protection around sensitive data. But of course, we also have the need to understand who is a refugee, who is female, who is gay, in order to know whether there's bias in the system. This is, I think, very much becoming a big pressure point for researchers or companies or even governments around the world, where they want to serve and protect bias and defend against bias. And well, other organizations are saying, well, I don't have any data, it's sensitive, I didn't want to collect it, or I can't use it for that purpose. Has this become part of the conversation?
Yeah, it's definitely there. While the discussion, fortunately, unfortunately, has taken a very strong gender route for the right reasons, and more than anything, we are out for disaggregated data, because a lot of data collection in Africa happens, there is no, it's really collective. So we are not able to, disaggregation is a whole thing by itself. But then in the process of categorizing this data, of course there are privacy risks that come about. There have not been animated discussions. If we're comparing what's happening in the US and what's happening in Africa, the discussion has not been animated. But there have been discussions on preventing such a situation, as use of class of protected classes in the to discriminate against people. So the discussion that has been mainly being had is mainly for women. How do we ensure that women and vulnerable groups are not excluded from such data systems? And this is especially for the right reasons, because, for example, if we're looking at the financial system, and fintech is huge in Africa as right now, we're looking at how can we ensure that data being collected by these fintech systems are being used in a sustainable manner to ensure that financial assistance can get to everyone, because fintech women are huge beneficiaries of fintech products. So there has been the discussion, but the discussion has mostly been, let's ensure that if we're disaggregating data in terms of gender, race, and those protected classes, let's ensure that there is economic benefit to these categories of people.
Great. We did some work a year or two ago with the Association of Older Americans, and the concern there was that they may be less likely to be using various technologies, and their particular needs may be left out in machine learning because they may not be using the latest gadgets and so forth. And what does that mean to the extent that products and services are being used by companies relying on machine learning to hone and refine and serve, and you just don't have this very huge demographic because they're less likely to be using, although of course they are in so many ways dependent on technology. In the minute or two we have left, I wanted to quickly touch two quick issues. One is we're seeing obviously data localization or data sovereignty concepts becoming sort of almost the second generation of concerns in legislation or for countries that are still doing data protection law, that being very much on the table. How is that showing up? And the second piece is yesterday, President Biden's office, the White House, announced, I think it was 6 principles on tech policy. 4 of them were pretty much fight the platforms. And in Europe, we see focus on specific regulation for the largest data collectors, and certainly a lot of concern that big tech is too powerful or has too much data or is anti-competitive. China, we see the government there, literally knocking down the CEOs of companies and telling them to be modest and stop being so expansive and arrogant in their activity. And but I just came back from the APAC region, and although of course there's concern, the dynamic is very different. The countries there are thinking of, how do they want to assert their legislative authority, but also where do they see areas where they defer, where they want to support maybe an advertising ecosystem as opposed to sort of looking to close it down, or just what's the dynamic in Africa? Obviously, these are large Chinese companies, large US companies. So you have some of the echoes of data colonialism and so forth, but also a deep desire for technology and development and fintech, as you noted. There's a big dynamic in the US where there's a desire and a legal mandate to open up banking to support fintech in the hope it'll lower fees and create more competition. But a huge concern by the CFPB, the Consumer Financial Regulator that has jurisdiction here, that big tech will swoop in and they'll then now control fintech. How is the dynamic in Africa on this particular data localization trend and the general battle with big tech?
Yeah, sure. So it's interesting that you mentioned data sovereignty, because it has been one of the topics that when we're discussing data governance that pops out so much, when discussing data in Africa. And the practice, I'd say generally the practice is divided. There are countries that are taking very stringent measures towards, localizing their data. There are those that are open, to cross-border data transfers. So the practice really, really differs from country to country. It would take an analysis of, something like the cloud policy. I think South Africa has a cloud policy, Nigeria has a cloud policy, Rwanda has a cloud policy. It requires a reading of what each country desires of each. And what you will notice about the countries is that they take also a sectoral approach. So one of the sectors that many countries are very keen on, ensuring that the data remains in their country is financial data. And this is also reflected again by the investments that are being made by the companies. And you mentioned China. And in Africa, Huawei has been making huge investments. And last year, I think it was in Senegal, the president of Senegal made an announcement that, all government data and digital platforms from foreign servers need to be moved to the new national data center that has been created by Huawei. And he was categorical and said this is to strengthen Senegal's digital sovereignty. But then already the underlying funder of the project causes you to ask very pertinent questions. Then how does then digital sovereignty looks like in Africa? Is it a mere statement, or should we be looking at the practice? Who's the investor? So the practice actually differs, and it requires, as I said, reading the different cloud policies and statements. When you listen to statements from presidents like the ones in Senegal, to understand really where the trajectory where our country is looking to. Because if you read the South African cloud policy, it does want the cross-border data transfer to happen, but it's also keen on ensuring that the country benefits from the data that comes out of South Africa. And you know, the issue, as you're saying, of the digital colonialism is very close to the hearts of many governments. Maybe we could deviate a bit and go into, you know, the digital tax issue. So last year, when the OECD came up with, you know, how to tax most of these big tech companies, a few African countries, you know, I think it was 2 African countries that pulled out and they said, you know, we don't agree with the OECD on how you want to divide these profits that come from big tech, because at the end of the day, we are not getting what we deserve. So the thought on data colonialism again also touches on trade issues, tax issues, and as I said, the practice really differs from country to country.
You know, as a former elected official and so forth, and I spend a lot of my time in politics, I try to help folks who are having this discussion understand that you can't tell countries that they ought not to exercise sovereignty. Countries need to enforce their laws, need to seek economic benefit, need to protect their citizens, and they can and should use their legal authorities to do that, and you will not ever convince anyone not to do so. The mistake, I think, is the notion that localizing the data is what is needed in order to do that, that the servers must sit, that the large football field sized facilities that consume massive, you know, energy and power and don't employ all that many people at all are a great benefit to have. We see in Europe, which has been, you know, a champion in some ways of using data protection law to support localization, a big pushback now, especially with power costs and local communities saying, wait, do I really want this gigantic building with no windows and just surrounded by, you know, security? Does that actually give me localization? Frankly, I'm going to go grab the servers. I don't make money necessarily. I need the jurisdiction. I need the perhaps mandate that local companies can have access, that there's not a anti-competitive world, or that you are really subject to my legal process, and that you have, you know, people here, and you have I have the ability to know that if you're going to violate my law, I'm going to be able to enforce against you, right? Those are clearly the case. Physically putting a football field in a big, you know, muddy park isn't necessarily, you know, the obligation, and then ends up creating all these other challenges in terms of fraud or international transfers or the like. So certainly an area where I think there's a lot of legal and technical progress to make in order to actually achieve what many countries work. On that note, thank you so much for joining me this afternoon in Kenya and morning here in the Washington, D.C. area. We're honored and value your thought and leadership, and looking forward to doing much more in Kenya and in a number of the other regions. I've been most continents in the world. I've yet to make it to Africa. So if anyone listening wants Mercy and I to have another version of this conversation with the latest issues or topics, let us know, and we'll figure out whether we can make the trip. I look forward to the first FPF events that hopefully we will be able to host in the upcoming future in the continent. And thanks everybody for listening. And Mercy, have a good rest of the day. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Jules. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.